I'm going to move back a bit so I don't loom large over Lincolnshire. It's lovely to be here and very nice to welcome those of you who could be in the cathedral last night for our service of Compline. And lovely that a few of these groups intersect with different parts of my life. So I grew up in Lincolnshire, shoe shopping in Grantham and doing my schooling in Spalding. I trained for ordination at Cranmer and Durham with Alan and others training me, so complaints to Alan after I speak would be great. And I'm trying to be friends with Southwark, who took my lovely colleague, Canon Catherine, to be your presenter. So you've got a real gift in Catherine, and we miss her. And I do forgive you mainly. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you a bit about Life is Local, about how we work out reconciliation in our own context. And my context is that I've been in Coventry for 2 years as Canon for Arts and Reconciliation. It was a new post when I was appointed to it, and it tries to pick up the two strands of Coventry Cathedral, which is a very strong reconciliation story, as you know, and as John reminded you. But also, if you know the cathedral at all, you'll know that it is a most wonderful collection of art from the 1950s and 60s. And we have a very rich arts and events programme showing contemporary art, being quite risky in some of the things that we put on. If you'd like to come and protest about our silent disco on the 12th of April, you can join others who will be doing that. But these two strands, the arts and reconciliation, had really been running on parallel tracks. They hadn't really intersected much at all. And so my particular role is to try and understand how the arts can serve the process of reconciliation, how they might reveal common ground between people and connect people emotionally and imaginatively when argument might hold them apart. And so what I say to you today will inevitably be peppered by a bit of poetry and other things, because that's really my heartland and how I share some of my work. This opening slide, believe it or not, is a bit of graffiti in Coventry. It is the most amazing bit of art up towards the canal basin, obviously meant to look like helium balloons, but it's brilliant. And because this is my context, it's a good way to start thinking about how I love my city in reconciliation and in mission. What they did yesterday afternoon is a powerful poem by British Somali poet Varsin Shir. In the poem, she traces the horror of her aunt's home back in Somalia being set on fire in an act of arson. And then in the poem, she cries out to God for her native land and for her adopted land. One is thirsty and the other is on fire, she writes. This is how her poem ends. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers over the whole world and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" It answered, "Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere." The everywhere of hurt is overwhelming, I think. We're confronted by so much brokenness, are witnesses to so much conflict, that we are at risk of compassion fatigue or of a failure of the imagination or of inertia born of overload. The truth is that we can't do very much about the everywhere, about the global, except, of course, to pray, to lament, to intercede, to bear witness, and to support those on the ground. But where we can have an impact, and where we're called to have an impact, is in our here and now. Life is local. Life is Local was the advertising slogan for the Doncaster Free Press when I was a curate in South Yorkshire. And early on in my curacy, I discovered just how local life is. It was at the end of an Alpha course, and we were having a social for Alpha graduates and their families. and I sat next to the mother of one of these graduates and asked her if she was local. "Oh no," she said, "I'm not from round here." And then she named a village just 7.5 miles from where we were meeting. For that woman, local was a very discreet network of streets and shops and relationships. Life is local. Being interrupted by Al Barrett and Ruth Harley urges us to reimagine the church's mission from the outside in. The whole book is really good, but what I find really striking is the way that the book is set up, with a really focused engagement with the local. So before they set out their thesis of what being interrupted might look like, what it looks like in Mark's Gospel, they set out a detailed, rigorous analysis of Al Barrett's parish, which is the inspiration and the case study for their work. They're saying context matters, and if you read their book, it's a really serious, thorough analysis of that community. And incidentally, it is because context matters that we came to realise that using Alpha Uncut in ex-mining, post-industrial, low-aspiration South Yorkshire just did not work. The Alpha model of sharing a meal before each session was deeply uncomfortable for people who rarely ate outside their own homes. Watching videos of groomed and glossy people listening to Nicky Gumbel in HTB was really alienating, as were many of the middle-class, Middle England references he used to illustrate his talks. Probably naughtily, we completely rewrote Alpha for South Yorkshire, and then we replaced it altogether with something more indigenous. Around the same time that Doncaster Free Press was proclaiming life is local, Yorkshire Bank ran an advertising campaign with the slogan, "Here is who we are. Here is who we are." In theological terms, this is incarnation. The word became flesh and lived among us, or as the message has it, the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighbourhood. I quite like that rendition of that verse. Jesus inhabited a time and a place and a neighbourhood, and what he offered specifically there, interacting with that culture, speaking that language, dealing with those politics. There is, of course, much of what Jesus said that is for all time and all place. But the conversation he had with the woman at the well, for example, is both like and unlike the conversation he might have at the till in Lidl or with the man waiting at the bus stop in the Burgesses just down the hill from here. Knowing who we are and where we are, a thorough, serious, nuanced knowing, is a prerequisite for the work of reconciliation and of mission. We can't just roll out franchise models and assume they can be imposed everywhere. It doesn't work. Life is local. Here is who we are. Or as the Coromila community puts it in their daily office, we will live the life we are living. Sounds obvious. I think it's quite profound. We will live the life we are living. So where are you? Who are you in that context? And are you living that life? Or another, you'd rather live somewhere else? So what does this commitment to incarnation mean for us at Coventry Cathedral? Well, firstly, it means understanding our foundational story in careful and emotionally intelligent ways. For example, this is to focus not just on the bombing of the cathedral in November 1940 and Provost Howard's heroic leadership of the city towards reconciliation. It's also for me to understand how ordinary people responded to the devastation of their city, of their homes, and how that shapes the culture of this city even now. As John has said, here's Provost Howard in the ruins. On Christmas Day 1940, he spoke to the BBC World Service about breaking this cycle of revenge, about building a gentler world. But he wasn't the outlier that some people have presented him to be. In fact, there was a poll conducted in May 1941 about the appetite of the British people for reprisal attacks on German cities. 76% of the rural northwest of England, which hadn't been bombed at all, was strongly in favour of such reprisals. But in Coventry, less than 50% were seeking that. There was not as much appetite for revenge in this city as you might imagine. No desire from Coventry people for German people to suffer the trauma they themselves had felt. Is this because Coventry had already by then had a long history of welcoming people fleeing trauma and violence? Is this why Coventry still has such an open policy towards refugees today? There's still in Coventry a very strong belief that the government knew that the bombing was coming and did nothing about it. This makes us, as a group of people, really cynical about authority, very hostile to the government, ready to protest on Broadgate by Lady Godiva on her horse. Subtle analysis of where you are takes time. It's perhaps not as attractive as caricature or casual summary, but it is vital to knowing the where and the who of those around you, and so your ability then to connect with them. The other aspect of incarnation, I think, is really knowing your neighbours. We are in a city where over 100 languages are spoken, where nearly 30% of the population are black or Asian, and where over 10% of the population is Muslim. Many of the people who now call this city home and enrich our life so much are here because they were part of the Windrush generation or because they were fleeing Idi Amin's persecution of Asian people in Uganda in the 1970s. And just saying both of those arrival stories immediately introduces complication. Take the Windrush generation, for example, where, as we know, the early welcome of the British government has been wholly overshadowed by the trauma of the Windrush scandal, where many people who had lived here and served here and made their homes here for many years were told they had no right to stay. Welcome for those people in our city feels now conditional, a mirage, something that is not to be trusted. Knowing those neighbours means that I have to be honest about how they know or perceive me. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm establishment, a representative then of the very group that betrayed them. And this impacts how we plan Windrush Day, which happens here in the cathedral every year. It means that I need to step back to make plenty of space, rather than imposing an Anglican model of worship on them, which hasn't changed very much at all since the 1950s, when Anglican churches, Church of England churches, literally shut their door on these people and said that they were not welcome. I will tell you, is it kind of Chatham House rules? That when I arrived here 2 years ago, the Windrush Day service was Book of Common Prayer Evensong, with somebody from the Windrush community reading a lesson. That is not what it's like anymore. That's this really shocking example of not making space, not understanding your neighbour, not allowing difference and diversity to enrich our time together. I quite often talk about this in terms of a guest-host dynamic. As a cathedral, we have a massive convening power. This is a gift, and sometimes it's good for the city. So, for example, soon after the 7th of October, one of our Hindu faith leaders said to us, we have to have a multi-faith prayer vigil for the people of Gaza, Israel, Palestine, the West Bank, and it must be in the cathedral. That was his request of us. So sometimes being the host is good, but it's important that that isn't always the role that we play. Last year we hosted an open iftar in the cathedral, cue lots of letters of complaints from Christians. 850 people, mainly Muslim, who came to break their fast in the cathedral. But since then, and building on the friendships I made in organising that with the local Muslim community, I've made a point to leave the precincts of the cathedral and go to Foleshill in Coventry, which is the area where most Muslims live, to be a guest. Ceding control really matters. It opens to us what we might learn from others, rather than assuming that we have all the answers ourselves. It allows others to give to us. It respects a culture of hospitality. And honestly, it's really discomforting. It shows us what it might be like to be in a minority, and never in my life have I felt that before I went to an Afghan restaurant on the Foleshill Road. I'll tell you about it over lunch. It's great food. The host becoming the guest is risky, disempowering, forces us to reframe our saviour complex, if we have it, that we are always the ones bestowing the riches. But it is also deeply Christ-like. Jesus becomes Zacchaeus' guest. Jesus asks to use Peter's boat, even though he can walk on water. And in becoming the guest, the host is transformed. But I would want to say, as a guest, we will be transformed too. So incarnation means knowing our story, knowing our neighbours, and knowing ourselves. Incarnation is key to reconciliation, and so is imagination. If incarnation is understanding about who we are and where we are, then imagination is about seeing who we might be, who we might become. In terms of being reconciled to others, imagination enables us to move towards their experience, to see life from their perspective. Theologian and... Oh, that's funny, that's flipped that order. There we go. Theologian and ethicist Stanley Hauerwas said, reconciliation happens when our enemy tells our story in such a way as we can say, yes, that's my story. Reconciliation happens when our enemy tells our story in such a way that we can respond and say, yes, that is my story. To be able to tell your enemy's story requires imagination, compassionate imagination. To be reconciled to God, to all that God wants for us and for those in our neighbourhoods, also demands imagination. How might our locality more reflect God's justice and mercy, we might want to ask? What could loving our neighbour look like here? How might we better steward our part of the earth? Imagining what might be enables us to take a journey from what is to what if. It's the title of a book by Rob Hopkins from a couple of years ago, and I really commend it to you. It's not a Christian book, it's a fantastic book. There are some fantastic books that aren't Christian.
We have one copy available to browse on our book.
Yeah, it's really good. The frontispiece of this book quotes graphic novelist Neil Gaiman. This is what he says. We all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we're in a society in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a field. But the truth is, individuals change the world over and over. Individuals make their future, and they do it by imagining how things can be different. My critique of what Neil Gaiman says would be his use of the word individual. If we know ourselves and our privilege, and if we get to know our neighbours, we will understand that imagination shouldn't be the work of an individual who imposes what reconciliation looks like on someone else, but that the process of imagining what might be is communal, so that even in the act of imagination itself, before anything comes to fruition, relationships are strengthened and people brought closer together through the sharing of dreams. Rob Hopkins describes this sort of collective imagination in his account of the transition movement, where localities come together to imagine their shared life differently. In Totnes, where Hopkins lived, the presenting issue was how to live more gently on the earth, to emit less carbon dioxide, to consume less. Together, Transition Town Totnes planted trees. They developed a communal kitchen garden at the railway station so that at the end of your commute, you could pick your salad leaves for supper. They crowdfunded a mill to grind flour, and they have built 27 homes for people in need to live in. See what can happen, how we can be reconciled to God's plan for a loving, cooperative community when together we imagine what might be. At the cathedral, we're in the really early stages of imagining an arts and events project that might bring diverse communities in the city together under a common theme. Working title is In Our Coventry Homes, and this is why. I'm hoping we've got sound.
Yeah. So I forgot to plug in.
You'll be able to hear enough, trust me. It's... He's singing, In Our Coventry Homes, we've got an accent exceedingly rare. If you want a cathedral, we've got one to spare. In our Coventry homes. That's probably enough of that. The project that we're developing, we're going to call In Our Coventry Homes. And the idea is that we're going to commission...
It is now connected to the sound, but that's the speaker speaking.
Oh, that's the speaker speaking.
Letting us know that it is connected to my devices.
Welcome, speaker. So the project, In Our Coventry Homes, is a way of bringing together the diverse communities in our city by commissioning a photographer to work with different communities to take pictures of their diverse, beautiful, difficult home life, and then bringing them together in a celebration in the cathedral as a way of us learning more about one another. And we hope that the outcome of the project might be that people discover home not just within their four walls when the door is closed, but in the neighbourhood and in the wider city. With the conflict in Gaza, this is a really pressing issue for us with such a diverse city. So, working for reconciliation locally, developing a reconciliation-shaped mission is for me about incarnation and imagination, and thirdly, about being interrupted, to borrow the title of the book I was telling you about. Being interrupted by people who might see things really differently from us, who have a different vision, who might have started something that we're not very keen on and would never have thought about ourselves. Crucially, for us as Christian people, it's also about being interrupted by the Spirit who swirls and eddies wherever she will. To be interrupted well demands humility, which lots of us find hard. To let go of our big idea, to let others hold sway, to recognise that God might be speaking to someone else, that God is not confined to the agendas of our PCCs or the conversation of Christians, however prayerful and engaged we might be. What is God already doing amongst you, without the sign-off of your strategy group or the logo of your local church? How might your question change from what should we do to how can we help? What can we join in with? I started with Worcestershire's agonising recognition of the everywhere, everywhere, everywhere of the world's pain. And I want to finish with a really short poem by Gideon Hugh, this poet here. And in a way, his poem answers the overwhelm of the everywhere. This is beautiful Coventry. Do not be afraid. To complete the repair of the world is not why you were made. You were created to play only your part, whatever is within your hands, whatever is the now of your heart. Do not be afraid. To complete the repair of the world is not why you were made. You were created to play only your part, whatever is within your hands, whatever is the now of your heart. Life is local. What is within your hands? What is the now of your heart? Better still, where is the intersection of the now of your heart and that of your neighbour's heart?